Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Simon, Simon Collier, and I'm a lecturer in history at the University of Hertfordshire. And I'm a bit of a generalist, but I have a particular sort of affinity and interest in the Cold War. So what I'd like to do today is take the opportunity to go through with a bit of a helicopter view, really, of issues to do with nuclear weapons and this sort of logic and politics and everything that goes with that within the Cold War. Why nuclear weapons? Because I think they provide a useful sort of tool for exploring wider issues with regards to the war. They're something that is present throughout and a constant issue during the Cold War. We won't have time to go down too many of those avenues, of course, today. But hopefully they can make you think about these sorts of issues and put you in a good position, really, to think about these as sort of as more than just weapons during the Cold War. So let's get started. My rather overboiled title here might require a little bit of unpicking. So the idea was to try and play something on the MAD acronym. And here it works just as appropriately for this idea of mutually antagonistic deterrence. If you think about the role of nuclear weapons during the Cold War, they were ostensibly there to protect nations, to provide a seat at the big table, to provide an ability for nations to protect against essentially the nuclear weapons of other nations or their allies. It also had the function or the effect of antagonizing each side, and so the very problems that they were there to solve also were exacerbated and perpetuated and made even more complicated by the presence of these weapons during this period. There is a logic to why these weapons were sort of in place and used during the Cold War, but that logic is slightly internal and slightly circular. It speaks to itself as much as it speaks to anything outside of the Cold War itself. Okay, right, bear with me just 1 second. I'm just going to try and find these people that have come in. Right, there we go. Okay, right. So this is what we're going to try and look at today, and I admit this is an ambitious amount of material to try and cover in what is a short talk and a short lecture. But these four main groupings and these four main issues to look at. The initial period of the Cold War, where America enjoyed, if that's the right word, a nuclear monopoly. And it was still trying to find its feet, trying to establish the rules of the game, essentially, and how nuclear weapons would be used or not, or impactful, or how they would shape and color the nature of the Cold War to come. So that period largely exists under the Truman administration during the race between the Soviet Union and America to find, exploit, and to detonate the technology that's required for their first HBomb, their first hydrogen bomb. The second period is a sort of a middle period in between this ambiguous first period and this final extended period of mutually assured destruction. And through this period, a couple of different options are tried, whilst the idea or the possibility of nuclear war still being winnable, still being a competition that can be, in some sense, completed successfully, while that still existed during that period. Eisenhower and Kennedy have very different ideas about how to manage the threat of nuclear weapons and the threat of conventional warfare during this period. But those different perspectives are as much a product of the changing nature of the Cold War as it is of the attitudes of those two men. So we'll have a look at that afterwards. we then enter the period of mutually assured destruction, of this sort of curious and slightly disturbing balance of forces that serves to make nuclear war unthinkable or untenable, an option that shouldn't be taken. And the idea is that this whole scaffold of sort of fear and doubt keeps the world safe, in the same way as some sort of house of cards supports the cards at the top of the pyramid. There are some problems with this, and clearly the success of mutually assured destruction is as much about luck and fortune and the cards in that pyramid falling where they did, rather than any inherent security of that particular organization. So we'll look at that next, and then briefly at the end look at the efforts to achieve some sort of control outside of leaving things to chance, of leaving things to mad, to keep things stable. Of course, these efforts existed alongside the reality of mutually assured destruction right the way through to the end of the Cold War. So that's what I want to try and have a look at today. So let's have a look. Right, so the atomic bomb, the A-bomb, the original nuclear device, has a place in history as something of a herald of what was to come, a herald of the arrival of the Cold War. It's a different type of weapon. It's perceived as a different type of weapon, and that's as much emotionally and psychologically as it is in real terms. It is a construction of the mind as much as a construction of reality. Carpet bombing, area bombing, this sort of destructive force has been applied on cities and targets in numerous countries around the world for years during the Second World War, and it has been normalized and internalized as a way of making war. In Japan, with houses made in many areas out of wood, which burns very easily, obviously, the turn to incendiary bombing has meant huge destruction on an almost unimaginable scale prior to the detonation of the atomic bomb. More people died during the firebombing of Tokyo during Operation Meeting House, which was a bombing raid on Tokyo in 1945. More people died during the firebombing of Tokyo than during the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. So conventional weapons were capable of doing far more damage and killing far more people than nuclear weapons were at this stage. And Hiroshima was far more lethal than Nagasaki was. There's a rather telling report by the American Strategic Bombing Survey that looks at Tokyo after this firebombing in Meeting House. And they say that probably more people lost their lives in Tokyo in that 6-hour period than any other time in the history of man. So clearly, atomic bombs aren't different in the terms of the immediate damage and suffering and loss of life that they can bring, but there is a difference there, and it comes of the nature of the bomb and what it does. So when the first atomic bomb test at Trinity is detonated, the magnitude of what has been achieved sort of beggars belief, really, and certainly did at the time. Richard Rhodes, who's a nuclear historian, noted that the flash was so bright when this bomb was detonated that if astronomers had been looking, away and at the moon, they would have been able to see the light reflected back from the face of the moon, which is, I think, probably the easiest way of underscoring the difference between this bomb and what had gone before. So the creation of the atomic bomb, or the project Manhattan, the American and Allied atomic bomb project, was put into place in response to Nazi efforts to develop a bomb. The use against the Japanese came as a result of circumstance, really, rather than anything else. Einstein had spoken to Roosevelt. He was absolutely insistent that the Nazis were more than capable and were trying to create this bomb, and that America must do something and must take the threat of the Nazi bomb seriously. And so he does. the Nazis turned out to be particularly inept at doing so, to the benefit of well, everybody apart from them. And Roosevelt essentially threw money and time and resources at Manhattan in order to make it a success. Well, Roosevelt may have taken the decision to pursue the bomb and to make the bomb, but he was spared the decision of whether to use it, and that decision fell to his successor, Harry Truman, a man who was fairly deeply ignorant of international affairs, a bit gauche, definitely in the shadow of Roosevelt politically. And he had to make this decision, this singular decision that that every single leader of a nuclear power since has had to say that they would be prepared to do upon achieving office, but have never been asked to actually do so. So this achievement, this development of an atomic monopoly, changes the way the United States thinks about itself, and it changes the nature of the origins of the Cold War. And we'll come to look at those in a second. But one of the real questions that has to be asked is what to do after the bomb has been detonated, after this first bomb has been dropped. Is it possible to take a route by which the atomic bomb and hopefully atomic energy will be harnessed and controlled and dealt with under international regulations, or will the Soviets, who are clearly going to be the opposition after the Second World War, going to be so put out, as the rest of the world is, that a nation could develop such a weapon in secret, in private, and then use it against an enemy that they would never trust them again in the first place anyway. So anyway, there are a couple of efforts to do this in the immediate aftermath and in the immediate run up to the detonation of the bomb at Hiroshima. There's a report called the Frank Report, which is released in June 1945, and which basically says that the American monopoly is going to be impossible to maintain after the Cold War. It's simply after the Second World War. It's simply impossible, and so the absolute focus of American policymaking after the Second World War should be achieving non-proliferation, achieving the stopping the spread of the bomb, basically, and achieving disarmament. And they take these ideas to the United Nations in 1946. America does, looking for a way in which disarmament could be before it becomes a problem, could be a priority. But they largely fail in their aims to do so because they're coming from a completely different direction, a completely different perspective than each other, the Soviets and the Americans. So one of the considerations about the use of the bomb is it used purely for in terms of an attack on the Japanese as part of the Second World War, or is there a Cold War calculation to it? Is there something that must be considered to do with the Cold War? And there has been a lot of ink used and spilt trying to decide to what extent the use of the bomb was a message to the Soviets and really a herald and a clarion call, a trumpet for the beginning of the Cold War itself. The basic consensus that around that sort of idea is that once it was clear that the bomb was capable of being used, then there was never any doubt that it was going to be used, and it was going to be used. The impact on the Soviets and the message to the Soviets was a bonus, was a nice thing to have. In a war so desensitized by that point, the use of the nuclear weapon, the use of the bomb, was almost guaranteed, really. So anyway, Truman gets the unenviable role of being the only man in history to drop or to authorize the use of a nuclear weapon, and he's sort of affected by this. He's unable to see the bomb as anything other than an instrument of terror from this point onwards, and to an extent, it cripples his decision-making processes or his ability to think clearly about the bomb during the 1940s. But anyway, there's an awful lot of complications during that period to be considered. Truman is, as you would expect, extremely reluctant to entertain the idea at all that he will go down in history as a man to use the atomic bomb or to authorize the atomic bomb 3 times. So it would take circumstances indeed for him to use that during the 1940s and during his presidency. But he wasn't really in a position to be able to use it much anyway. So whether it's a product of his desire to stay away from it, or it's a product of sort of inefficient bureaucracy, this one man in the world with the ultimate authority to use the atomic bomb in the world's only atomic monopoly had no idea how many atomic bombs or America had, or what capability America had to deploy or use them. And this carries on until 1947. So for 2 years, pretty much after the end of the war, he was in no position to make any informed decision about America's use of the bomb. The answer to how many they had was not many, really. They had about 9. So they had 9 in mid-1946, 13 in mid-1947, and about 50 by mid-1948. These were extremely inefficient weapons. They took 39 people about 2 days to put together in order to deploy. So they are not responsive. They're not agile. They're really restricted to the kind of deployment that this was seen in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki. So there's a limit to America's desire to use the bomb, because it all falls ultimately at the feet of Truman. And there's a limit in America's capability to deploy the bomb. And this is hugely complicated at the start of the Cold War by America's almost complete ignorance of the Soviet Union. Some of the maps they have of the Soviet Union date back to the Tsarist era. And there are huge areas about which they know nothing. Any idea of targeting something specific, even if they were technologically capable of doing it, that possibility doesn't exist. Bombs are too big, intelligence is too poor, the capability of deliverance is too restrictive. So nuclear weapons in this period are essentially nothing but a blunt tool to be used against the population if they have to be. So America is also in this period of time stuck with sort of preparing to strike back. Preventative war is not an option as far as Truman is concerned. He won't do anything he won't strike first. He won't instigate war at all. And this remains essentially the firm decision of both sides, both superpowers during the Cold War. Korea is you can see Korea as a litmus test here, really. Korea as an opportunity to see whether the bomb is going to be used, whether it has any practical purpose while it is still something that the use of which could still be entertained. But it never really has to be seriously thought through. There's never a particularly cogent political reason or an effective military target in Korea to use the bomb on. So the question is somewhat moot. For the Soviets, who don't have the bomb but are investing and engineering like crazy to ensure that they will manage to catch up by the end of the decade, as they do, and probably 2 years or so before the Americans thought they would have any chance of doing so. The Soviets are in a position where they face nuclear weapons with conventional forces and with no real way to address them in kind. And so what you would think of is that the position here, and this is surely what America wanted, that they're in a position to influence or to affect the decision-making process of the Soviet Union because of the potential impact and the power of this weapon that they have at their disposal. And it has the opposite effect. Stalin is sufficiently concerned about not being seen to be under any sort of in any sense cowed or influenced by America's nuclear monopoly. That as historians like Wojtek Masny have shown, he would actually act with an abundance of pushback, to the point he would actually, he would be encouraged to act more aggressively and more decisively than perhaps he would, just to show that he wasn't scared by that nuclear monopoly, just to show that the Soviet Union would not take it into its calculations. Okay, so once the Soviets get the bomb in 1949, an arms race develops, which is almost inevitable. Arms races are a fact of history. They've happened at various other times. There's the Dreadnought race at the start of the First World War. The idea, the attempt to gain a superior position in a certain type of applicable force, a certain type of arms, has existed from time immemorial, really. There's a difficulty here, though, for both sides when they're trying to sort of manage this arms race, and it's a defining characteristic of the arms race that it simply gets out of hand. More weapons are needed because more weapons can be made, essentially. And there becomes a qualitative and a quantitative arms race in combination. Each side wants as many weapons as they can possibly deploy within reason, and wants them to be as technologically advanced and adaptable, precise, and all these sorts of things at the same time. But because they're unable to establish a genuine strategy, mutually assured destruction, when it comes along in the 1960s, isn't a strategy. No one's aiming for that. What it is a realization of reality and an acceptance of a sort of a de facto stability. This inability to sort of develop a cogent and a coherent and a long-lasting strategy, combined with real ignorance of what the other side intends, means that they have no real option than to just keep throwing bombs and throwing missiles and throwing alternatives at the problem. There's a fear as well in terms of technology that if one side doesn't keep up with the other, they will lose the initiative. Especially once mutually assured destruction is a thing, is a reality. The fear is that if one side manages to get a technological edge, and this is where issues come up in the 1970s and 1980s with multiple warhead missiles and with talk about the Strategic Defense Initiative. Once one side gets an edge, then that house of cards that has been built up for mutually assured destruction will collapse, and one side will suddenly discover that the war, or believe that the war, is winnable, which will be a disaster for the other side. On the other side of this, the arms race it makes no sense. It's illogical. Once you assume and accept mutually assured destruction, once you accept there's a point you can get to when the other side cannot stop you from retaliating to anything they do and destroying you utterly, there's no point keeping on building more and more missiles. They are just going into stockpiles. This logic does not really seep into the understanding of either side at an operational level, really. Okay, so Soviets joined the party in 1949, as I said. So it takes them a short-ish time to catch up with America. But both sides, I mean, the Soviets are trying to develop the H-bomb in parallel with their standard atomic bomb, and the Americans have been pushing for the H-bomb once they realized what the situation is with the Soviets, and they're absolutely determined to once the Soviets get their own bomb. And the H-bomb is a qualitative difference. It is hugely more destructive, hugely more impactful, hugely more important, really, in terms of changing the nature of the game. So clearly, when you're talking in megatons instead of tens or hundreds of kilotons, the destructive force of these bombs is enormous. But they're also, once they're developed, more efficient. They can do more damage due to their size. The smaller bomb, bigger bang, basically. And they therefore mitigate against some of these problems of accuracy and the difficulties each side has of delivering weapons precisely. And they mean that for example, ICBMs become much more possible. If you've got something outputting a huge multi-megaton explosion, you don't have to be that accurate with your missile. The smaller missiles you had to be. The thing is, though, they are too big, really. They have little practical application apart from annihilation. The only thing they serve to do is to destroy significant areas of somebody else's country. They have little to no military application. Unless you manage to devastate someone's country, the military of that opposition will be taking their steps at all stages to mean that you can't sort of decapitate and annihilate their entire armed forces. They take steps to avoid that. So they are political weapons. They exist to be employed for political reasons. They exist to bully and browbeat other nations in theory. They exist to enable you to stand up to other nations in theory, and what they really exist for is to fill the need to provide a means of annihilation, should that be required. Okay, so that's a little bit of a background there from during the Truman years, and so now let's have a look at sort of something a bit more doctrinal, really, about some of these sort of political and strategic decisions that are made during this kind of intervening period between sort of the bombs not really being that important in the scheme of things, and then becoming locked into mutually assured destruction. So this whole point about nuclear war during this period is that there has to be a belief that it's winnable, otherwise it's pointless. If nuclear war isn't winnable, if you can't succeed at it, if you can't win, then this can only end in sort of pacifism or defeatism. It becomes pointless. So as much as anything, this period is characterized by a search for some way of making this technology applicable and useful, rather than just entirely destructive. So during this period, this sort of pre-MAD era, there are some issues that come up. How to deploy nuclear weapons, how to best use them, and there's a lot of talk about this idea of first strike. That the most useful way of using a nuclear weapon is to drop it on your opponent's head before they know anything about it, and that will, if you can do enough damage, that will serve you best. There's something morally wrong with that, even within the context of nuclear weapons, and people realize that fairly soon. But it is something that is thought about and discussed, and it even comes up. It rarely makes it out of wargaming and discussions. It certainly never makes its way into policy. But there are some discussions during the American nuclear monopoly where American planners are suggesting maybe we should just threaten the Soviets and get concessions out of them, and if they don't do what we want them to do, suggest that we're going to use the bomb on them while we can. So it does exist. It does exist there, but the moral implications are quite significant. Preemption exists as a possibility. The idea that you can see it's not a first strike, which is like stabbing somebody in the back. Preemption is seeing that they are preparing, seeing that they're going to go to war, and doing it first, and doing it to them first. But that only makes sense if you're guaranteed that you can do more damage to your opponent than you're going to receive yourself, and it's a balance of resolve and capability. So one of the key ideas is this idea of second strikes. The idea that the way to be most secure, the way to deter, the way to put your opponent off from launching a strike at you, is to be able to inflict so much damage on them in return that the thought of launching that first strike is too much to bear. It doesn't make any logical sense, and this seems like a sensible idea. But there's a paradox here. So if you'll bear with me, you have to be absolutely determined to launch a second strike for it to be a truly effective deterrent. If the other side thinks that you might hold back, or you might not do it, or you might vacillate or hesitate, then the chances of that first strike being aimed at you becomes more significant, becomes more likely. There can't be a question at all in the mind of your opponent that you will strike back. But the rational thing to do is the opposite. The rational thing to do is to not launch immediately, to hedge your bets, to keep your weapons that you've still got back in case you need them for later. It means that deterrence has failed. And also, if you launch them weakened as you are, you might just get hit again, and you might just be provoking more retaliation from the other side back at you. And the logic of a second strike has disappeared by the time a first strike has occurred. If you think about that, deterrence has failed by that point. So the whole reason of having a second strike is only logical up until the point somebody actually attacks you. And after that, it becomes illogical or less logical to use it. And because of this, and because of these sort of questions around this, there was a need to make sure that the people responded quickly. And in fact, the comparatively short time for American presidents to respond to a first strike was seen as an advantage to many policymakers. So that's the paradox then of use of nuclear weapons and use of second strikes. Other paradoxes exist here, other issues exist here. This idea of extended deterrence, this idea that America will, not attacked by nuclear weapons, but Europe is, that America will launch nuclear weapons and drag herself into a nuclear confrontation to protect her allies in Europe, and that's something that needs unpicking and thinking about quite well. There's also this idea of taboo. Nina Tannenwald suggests that rather than sort of fear of deterrence and fear of striking, one of the real key things that limits and constrains people's use of nuclear weapons is that it transgresses norms. It transgresses human and national norms of behaviour, and that in fact is one of the most effective ways of stopping using it. And if that's true, of course, then the whole idea of anything else to do with this is somewhat reduced. Nuclear weapons become far more of an issue and far more logical. During this period, this move to thermonuclear weapons, you have this sort of division between impractical weapons on one side and tactical weapons on the other side. ICBMs, all these sort of things are connected to the space race, and you have this weird dichotomy, sort of weird contrast between something that is aiming towards the most singular of man's engineering achievements at the time, and the other thing that's trying to wipe him out. And they both share technology and they both share research. But you have increasingly big bangs to the point where the Soviets developed something called the Tsar bomber, which they can only detonate for half the explosive power that it's capable of producing, because there's no other way of getting the guys that dropped the bomb away from the site than to sort of dial it back. And then it gets tiny. And on the picture on the right there is a Davy Crockett recoilless rifle, which shoots a 20-ton, so it's 20-ton, not kiloton, nuclear weapon outside of it, which I suspect could get quite exciting using it. It goes down to the ridiculousn's of this, America's special atomic demolition munition, which is a tiny little device that is designed to be, the idea is, I'm not messing with you here, is that special forces parachute out of a plane with it, put it in place, set a timer on it, set it to go bang, and then run away. This seems to defy all logic, but this is this sort of deviation that's happening. So Eisenhower comes into power, and he sees this idea of American security quite holistically. He sees it about the protection of home and the American way of life, and that the nuclear weapons essentially are just another weapon. He has to make the use of nuclear weapons seem credible. And he looks to this idea of the new look strategy. in that he's going to make nuclear weapons sort of prop up the considerable cost of defending America and let conventional forces kind of take a second stage. It's not just Eisenhower; the British are on board with this sort of idea as well. And there's a couple of key agreements, NSC 68 and NSC 162/2, in 1950 and 1953, which point towards this new idea, really. NSC 68, which I'm sure you've had a look at, looks at this sort of threat of the Korean War, the threat of the Soviet bomb, and argues really forcefully for the expansion of America's military capability. And NSC 162/2 shifts that defense burden away from conventional forces and onto nuclear weapons. It's the cornerstone, really, of Eisenhower's policy. He sees them as a practical weapon. If they're not usable, what's the point? But he has a realistic view, and I'm quoting here. Eisenhower says, "It's cold comfort for any citizen of Western Europe to be assured that after his country is overrun and he's pushing up daisies, someone alive will drop a bomb on the Kremlin." And so he's quite balanced in his view. But he agrees with Truman that the idea of preventative war, the idea of first strike, is not tenable, is wrong. With the arrival of thermonuclear weapons, as I've said, the game is changed from that point onwards. But the unfortunate thing for Eisenhower and his idea of massive retaliation, this idea that if you chuck something at us, nothing's off the table. We will come back at you with everything we've got, and most of what we've got is nuclear weapons. Even with that, it becomes fairly clear that it's impossible to deliver a kind of a knockout punch to the Soviets. Even if the Americans could land a really telling blow by the sort of the mid to late 1950s, it was still assessed that the Soviet Union could probably still field pretty massive armies for as much as 2 years after that. So if you can't make the use of nuclear weapons decisive, what's the point? So Kennedy responds to this with this idea of flexible response, the idea of making it possible to escalate and manage and secure the escalation of problems of crises around the world without having to go quite literally nuclear as soon as something happens. Puts conventional defense spending back on the table. Looks to be able to fight wars across the range of options that he should be able to do and believes he can do because America can afford to do it. It increases the number of options. It increases it pushes the threshold for when nuclear weapons become the thing that you use higher and higher and higher in the table of possible outcomes, basically. Obviously, it costs a lot more doing it this way. And Kennedy is working under this idea of these primitive rules of prudence. There should be no direct conflict between superpowers. No one should use nuclear weapons. Everyone should respect their spheres of influence. And flexible response feeds into this. You can have a go anywhere else to your heart's content, but not in someone else's backyard. The idea here really is that massive retaliation, that idea that you come back with everything that you possibly could, that threat isn't credible at many levels when the other side has the capability to do it back. It beggars belief in many circumstances that anyone would do that to you, knowing that you could do it in return. Now, the Soviets, in all this, clearly are hampered at the start by not having any nuclear weapons, which does make nuclear weapon and nuclear doctrine quite difficult. But what happens really with them is they parallel what the US develop, and they're slightly behind them throughout the Cold War, really. Throughout the 1950s, when they do have some nuclear weapons but not enough, they still invest and still look to use conventional forces to be the means by which they will address any attack or any assault or any war against NATO or the Americans or anyone in Western Europe. They intend to have enough troops that it doesn't really matter how many bombs the Americans have. They'll still have enough troops to keep shoving them through the gaps where the bombs haven't gone off, and they'll be able to win, basically. After Cuba, particularly, the Soviets determined that they're never going to have to negotiate in a crisis or in a situation like that from a position of weakness ever again. And so they decide that the only option is to achieve a sort of credible parity and a credible level of deterrence and a credible, if not equivalent, level of capability, so that they will always be treated as equals and as fairly like someone at the big table. And so what happens at this point, therefore, is the reaction to Cuba is the engine that really pushes the nuclear situation in the world towards the reality of mutually assured destruction. So MAD has a logic and it has a paradox as well, clearly. And what mutually assured destruction really offers is equality and annihilation. That there is no way to escape the implications and the impact and the destruction of the conflict that you involve yourself in. Both sides possess enough weapons to do enough damage to ensure the destruction of the other, and will respond in kind to any attack, and thus is the equilibrium maintained. What it does is it essentially looks to do is to play off the rationality of various actors in the Cold War. As long as everybody acts rationally and nobody makes a mistake, then no one's going to attack, and this edifice of mutually assured destruction remains in place. And as long as no one looks to cheat the system by making nuclear war survivable as well. And it exploits mutual vulnerabilities. Shoot first, die second, and this is why anti-ballistic missile technology and the Strategic Defense Initiative were so potentially destabilizing. So Cuba's a turning point. Everyone stares into the abyss, confronted by the reality of the situation. They do not like what they see, and so they look to act against it. But there's issues here, clearly, to do with rationality. And personality has an extraordinarily strong role to play in the history of the Cold War. And once you introduce actors such as Mao, who is quoted several times as being rather flippant with the possibility of losing a few 100,000 or a few million or tens of millions of his population, mutually assured destruction looks far less stable from that point onwards. So there's a number of flashpoints that occur during the Cold War, which are impactful in different ways. There's an awful lot of saber rattling that goes on. The Americans talk about using nuclear weapons, or the possibility of using nuclear weapons to support the French around Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, as the French are coming to the end of their tenure there. Khrushchev talks about using nuclear weapons in 1956 when the British and the French invade Suez. But the key flashpoints that you need to remember and to be aware of and look at here are Cuba, Berlin, and something that happens in 1983 called Able Archer. So Cuba, you will no doubt know all about, and I don't have the time to really go in here. Berlin remains an issue, essentially because West Berlin is indefensible by any other means than nuclear weapons, and both sides know that. So the issue of escalation always exists in Berlin throughout the Cold War. Able Archer 83 is a command and control exercise, and what it is an example of how things can go wrong with no intent. And it comes off the back of an exercise, an annual exercise called Hertfordshire, where American troops test their ability to fly lots of troops across the Atlantic under radio silence in the quiet, drop them into pre-positioned tanks and vehicles, and deploy them. And unfortunately, this time in 1983, what essentially happens is that the Soviets get the wrong end of the stick, and they're not entirely sure whether it's an exercise or whether it is an actual commencement to war. Because of course, Hertfordshire is the actual war plan, and so the exercise looks exactly the same as what will subsequently happen. One final thing here, really, to have a look at, because I'm aware that I'm sort of pushing through time-wise, is this idea of the stability-instability paradox. So the question of whether nuclear weapons bring peace or stability to the Cold War is an important one. Okay, and the answer is yes, depending on what sort of circumstances. What the stability and stability paradox says is that with mutually assured destruction, what it doesn't do is make the world a safer place. It makes the world for the superpowers safer. And what it does is it pushes conflict out to the margins. It in fact makes conflict far more likely and far more inevitable. It's a sort of a telling reminder, really, of the fact that there's of the amount of people that die because of the Cold War. Something like 20 million people in connections to various conflicts, etc., all the way around the war. Very, very few of those happen to be people from the West or from the superpowers. A handful in comparison. So the stability and stability paradox, that last sort of idea, is that these weapons, which are there supposedly through mutually assured destruction to bring some measure of stability and rigidity to the world system, only do so for sort of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, those main powers and those main adherents to those alliances. The global South and the Third World are left to suffer really in the same way as they always have been. Okay. There is a search for control here, an effort to maintain some level of constraint to stop the Cold War from becoming intolerable and untenable. The installation of the hotline at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the opening of, or the attempt to open, to provide open dialogue between America and Moscow, is a significant step, because not knowing what each other is doing is a huge determinant for why the Cold War is so problematic. Obviously, this hotline is dismantled at the end of the Cold War when everyone is back on friendly terms. It's worth making a note that the hotline was reinstalled under the Obama presidency with the Kremlin. Read into that what you will. Other issues here: the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The attempt to start limiting the growth of, or the spread on the numerical spread of nuclear weapons during this period, are significant too. And it's really when you get to start in the 1980s, the strategic arms reduction talks, where efforts are being made to claw nuclear weapons, sort of back from the position that they're in, and real progress is being made. I'm aware that I am running on with time here, so I will bring this to a close now. A last couple of points to make. One of the key issues with the Cold War is that it is asymmetrical during the period. One of the key threats to stability in mutually assured destruction is that the Cold War is asymmetric. Advances move at different paces. America makes several advancements that fundamentally change the way that the Cold War is looked at, and the way the Cold War is competed in. You'll all, I hope, be familiar with this idea of the triad. The triad is the deployment of land-based nuclear missiles, bombers, and submarine-launched nuclear missiles. The idea being that if you have a successful triad, you are assured of a second strike. It's impossible for you to fight against it. Basically, it's impossible to find those submarines and deal with all the other options that are there. Well, the Soviets never really had this. The Soviets have comparatively few missile boats. They only developed those by the end of the 1960s. Their bomber fleet is not really that appropriate, and is not really comparable to the Americans at all. So what they have are land-based missiles, which are increasingly vulnerable as technology changes. And this is the engine that drives instability towards the end of the Cold War. Okay, so just to sum up there, and I apologize for having to sort of rush through the end, but I've talked for far too long. The logic of the Cold War is sort of questionable. The logic of nuclear weapons in terms of the Cold War is questionable. They're full of paradoxes, full of inherent instability. Kennedy when he's interviewed or when he's talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, believes the chance of conflict is sort of 1 in 3. Other observers or people involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis are staggered at the end of it and concerned by variables that they've missed. And there's an idea here really that is sort of in counterfactuality, that in terms of nuclear weapons, if the whole Cold War was run again, really as a simulation, mutually assured destruction, these other functions and frameworks that were put in place or that became established would not probably protect in the same way. The sense is, the feeling is that MAD worked well. The truth of the matter is that MAD worked, and we were lucky, essentially. As I've noted, nuclear weapons probably did bring peace and stability to parts of the world, but they pushed problems and the competition of the Cold War out into other regions, into other places around the world, and destroyed and uprooted sort of lives and governments and countries ad nauseum, really. So while they may have protected the people that owned them, they certainly didn't protect the people that did not. As purely defensive weapons, as they essentially were, because nobody was going to launch them in a first strike, they nonetheless had the effect of making the Cold War more tense, making the Cold War more combative, of driving a logic of competition in terms of nuclear weapons right the way through, and essentially prolonging the Cold War in terms of disruption and in terms of antagonism, really, for the whole time. So they in a sense, if circumstances had been different, they wouldn't have brought the peace and stability that they perhaps did to the Cold War. Again, it's a question of flukes and chances. And in the terms of what difference did they make, apart from costing an awful lot of money, causing an awful lot of misery in the third world, driving some technology such as space technology, given that both sides had disavowed the first use of nuclear weapons, and they never, either of them, the Soviets or the Americans, ever considered striking first in anything approaching a policy decision. They simply existed to make the war worse. They were never going to change anything in it. And in fact, at the end of it, at the last, when Gorbachev is making overtures towards Reagan, he's doing so because he believes that Reagan is looking to find peace, and he realizes that they're no longer a problem, that they are irrelevant. No one is going to attack the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is not going to attack anybody else. So ultimately, the difference they make is one of context, is one of issues. But although they're central to the Cold War, in a sense, they were somewhat irrelevant to how the Cold War would ultimately pan out. Okay, thank you very much for bearing with me as I chopped through there. Right. Okay. Now, obviously, unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to have a look through all your comments there. Does anyone have any questions? And I will do my best to field them. I'm aware I'm keeping people later than I said I would. The USSR guy. Is there any benefit to tactical nuclear weapons? Well, this was one of the discussions that was really prevalent under Eisenhower's presidency, because Eisenhower wanted nuclear weapons to be usable, and he thought that tactical nukes, particularly the use of those, could be restricted, and that they could be used much in the same as any other destructive but discrete weapon. And he was almost certainly wrong. And later thinking on this was that there was far too much risk that tactical nuclear weapons would cause an escalation, that a sort of a tit for tat would take place on the battlefield, once there was enough of them, and that it would that this sort of thin, rather blurred line between tactical nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear weapons would be broken, and it would change from being something that happened on a small scale into something that turned into a strategic conflict. What was the outcome of Able Archer 1983? Well, there's some thought that the Soviets, that certain important people in the sort of Soviet hierarchy realized that it probably wasn't what they were afraid of. Jets were scrambled, steps were taken, the sort of Soviet equivalents of changing your sort of DEFCON status, but it never really developed into a crisis rather than a deeply concerning set of events. But the important thing about Able Archer is when a Russian double agent reported to the American authorities about what the effect of Able Archer had been, and Reagan got to hear about it, it absolutely terrified him. And what it did was it stopped him shouting about evil empires and with all this sort of bellicose rhetoric that he'd been using for years, and it made him step back and think about the way he was framing the Cold War and the risks he was bringing, talking like that. And it just so happened that happened pretty much at the same time as the last old guy in the Soviet gerontocracy died off and Gorbachev comes to power. So the timing of Able Archer is really significant in creating an environment for the beginning of the end of the Cold War. MacArthur wanted to nuke China. MacArthur was a lunatic, and unfortunately he was a celebrity and a personality, and which made it very difficult to marginalize him and to take him out of circulation, so to speak. But yes, MacArthur definitely wanted to use them, and it was it was a key determinant in Truman deciding not to let him anywhere bloody near them, because the implications, as I said in the lecture, I think there wasn't any real practical use for them, so they would have been more of a demonstration and a terror weapon than a practical weapon against. There were no big cities or strategic strongholds in the north of Korea to use, and all it would have done would have drawn massive public outcry and drawn the Soviets arguably into the war. Soviets, of course, who had weapons at that point. Where are we? Was the nuclear threat influential to the Cold War in Asia or the Korean War in any way? In Korean War, no, not really. It served to make British and European allies of the Americans deeply concerned that Truman would even consider moving nuclear weapons to the region. He kind of faked it with some bombers that were nuclear capable, didn't have any nuclear weapons at the time, and then subsequently, in a couple of years into the war, he did actually move some temporarily to Guam, I think it is. That terrified everybody. So it was fairly decisive in creating tensions between the Western allies. The provision of and the kind of the way that Khrushchev went about the provision of nuclear secrets and nuclear technology to China during the 1950s was a source of tension between them as well. China didn't like, Mao didn't like the way that Khrushchev was palling up to everybody and stopping being a Stalinist right at the point where China was going through its sort of heading deeply into Stalinist interpretation of communism at the same time. And it made, that it caused tensions as well. And also, establishing itself as a nuclear power, China establishing itself as a nuclear power, freed it up somewhat from its reliance on the Soviet Union. It gave them a voice on the big table. It allowed them, as part of, to be more confident in the Sino-Soviet split and to be more confident in approaching and making overtures towards and between America. And they enter into sort of heading towards those discussions in the 1970s that created this multipolar world and helped bring about détente to an extent. Do I think that the reduction in nuclear weapons through treaties is pointless? Well, yeah, at the moment it is. It's not having any effect. It's almost impossible to affect any meaningful change. So there's some the restrictions on certain types of nuclear weapons has been important. It was important to think about sort of restricting the neutron bomb, really. With the idea, the neutron bomb, if you didn't know, is a bomb that lets out all the radiation and the electromagnetic pulse, but doesn't really blow stuff up. So it becomes a much more, in theory, usable weapon if you're invading somewhere, because you don't destroy the country that you're invading. And the sort of limitations of those is a good idea. But it's more about what the treaties mean in terms of effort, I guess, rather than results. It means that there's an important dialogue. The treaties that were created previously, they were in the 70s and into the 80s. They were important because they were stepping stones along the way of bringing the Cold War to an end. So they were important in that sense. In terms of either side's ability to make the planet glow brighter than the sun, they've had no effect. Tactical nuclear weapons make the world a more unstable place. Absolutely. Well, any nuclear weapons do. But the danger with tactical nuclear weapons is that you can steal them. It's quite difficult to steal a great big intercontinental ballistic missile that is in a silo somewhere. Tactical nuclear weapons, the smaller tactical nuclear weapons, are really small. You can pop one in the back of a small van. So the possibility of being able to them falling into the wrong hands, it takes less people and less effort. So they do definitely make the world a more dangerous place. Do nuclear weapons have an effect on the Soviet Union's plans in Korea? Yeah, probably. It's difficult to really decide what Stalin really thinks about things without sort of definite ideas. It certainly would have had an effect, but don't forget that he was as cognizant as anyone that it was essentially impossible to make a difference other than a bad one with nuclear weapons there. Stalin is always known as someone who takes the sort of the half a loaf approach to things. He's always looking to his advantage. Never wanted to push his hand too far. So he would have been, his desires there would have been tempered. The interests there are not the same as the interests in Eastern Europe at all. Do I think hypersonic missiles will lead to a new arms race? Yes, is the simple answer to that. They're a new technology, and they are incredibly impactful on naval forces. So the potential impact on America, who thrives abroad on the back of their navy, with their ships all of a sudden becoming incredibly vulnerable, at least as far as we know, to these sorts of missiles, then they will create. There's a potential there for creating an arms race in the vein of the sort of the dreadnought race of the first few years of the 20th century, of weapon versus defense. Do I think the nuclear element is the most important driving force of Cold War tensions? Ideology and insecurity are the most important driving forces. Nuclear weapons don't really make a huge difference to the actions of the superpowers, except in terms of their actions against each other. Are the nuclear weapons impractical? Still impractical. Had nuclear weapons not been developed, do you think a conventional World War III was inevitable? So nuclear weapons are in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. It's fairly clear that America is not in any position to really invade and impose its will in the Soviet Union, and it's fairly clear that the Soviet Union is unable to project force beyond its borders. That remains the case for a considerable amount of time. It's difficult to see how things would happen much further than maybe sort of 5 or 10 years later. But without nuclear weapons, it becomes increasingly difficult to see how either side could have acted decisively. There may have been I'm really spitballing here, but there may have been a change somewhat in the nature of NATO and the sort of connection with the ability to sort of, and the will to defend NATO, and those connections across the sea. It might have become less important to the Americans to an extent, but equally it could have made no difference whatsoever. I think it's extremely difficult to come up with a convincing counterfactual. I'm not in command of the issues that I'd need to be to make a really informed decision on that. Do you think we'd see such a threat from terrorism without the existence of nuclear weapons? Yeah, really. I don't. Nuclear weapons don't make any difference to America's desire to muck around in other people's countries for oil, and that's one of the major causes of instability in the world now, and religious conflicts and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I think I've got through. Oh no, I was about to say I think I've got through most of the messages, most of the questions there. Does anyone else have a question that they want to ask? Okay, so my understanding is that that this plus my slightly accelerated rush through at the end, because I tried to pack too much content in. I probably should have done two lectures. I believe that recording will be made available to people, and I'll also try and put together a sort of not so much an FAQ, but a list of some resources and some interesting websites and articles that you can read to sort of explore some of these issues in a little bit more depth. Okay. Well, thank you very much then, everybody. Thank you for your attention. And yes, I unfortunately, and I believe that one of my colleagues is online and will probably virtually wrap me across the knuckles at some point. I intend to offer another one of these, briefer and more compact and more fitting in with the time, in the week prior to the return to university, so the week of around the sort of 16th to 20th of January. The intention is to do that on the hot wars in the Cold War, so look at Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, and use those as sort of points of reference. So yes, absolutely, and I'll make sure something comes out on that.